You stand in the blazing Egyptian sun at Abydos, just behind the temple of Seti I, looking at something that should not be there. The Osirion sits 50 feet below ground level, a massive megalithic structure that appears so different from everything around it that most tourists walk right past, never realizing they are looking at what might be Egypt's most important archaeological anomaly. The temple above it is beautiful, covered in hieroglyphs and painted reliefs, celebrating the reign of Seti I, around 1280 BCE. But the Osirion below uses none of those techniques. Instead, you are looking at colossal blocks of red granite and limestone, some weighing over 100 tons, fitted together without mortar in a style that looks nothing like 19th dynasty construction. Egyptologists say Seti I built both structures as part of the same complex, a symbolic tomb for Osiris to complement his temple. But here is the problem that keeps engineers and archaeologists arguing after 100 years of study. The Osirion's construction technique, its weathering patterns, its architectural style, and even its position relative to the temple all suggest it came first, possibly thousands of years before Seti I was born. The conventional explanation seems straightforward at first glance. Seti I, one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs, is said to have commissioned both the temple and the Osirion as part of a single grand project honoring Osiris, the god of the afterlife and resurrection. The temple would serve as a place of worship, while the Osirion, built in an intentionally archaic style, would function as a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb where the pharaoh could be identified with Osiris himself. This interpretation has dominated Egyptology since the structure's formal excavation in the early 20th century. It explains why the Osirion sits behind the temple, why it uses older-looking construction methods as a deliberate stylistic choice to evoke Egypt's distant past, and why no royal burial was ever found there. The problem is that this explanation requires us to believe that the architects of Seti I deliberately chose to make their work exponentially harder. They would have abandoned the refined techniques developed over 1,500 years of pyramid and temple building to wrestle with blocks that even modern engineers struggle to comprehend moving. It asks us to accept that workers using copper tools decided to work with 100-ton granite blocks when limestone was readily available and far easier to shape. It demands that we ignore the weathering evidence, the construction logistics, the architectural evolution, and the uncomfortable fact that the Osirion shows characteristics that only appear elsewhere in Egypt's most ancient monuments, structures we cannot date with certainty. Think about what 100 tons actually means in practical terms. That's the weight of approximately 60 cars, or a fully loaded 747 aircraft's maximum cargo capacity, compressed into a single block of stone. Modern construction cranes rated for this capacity are massive pieces of equipment requiring careful engineering, solid foundations, and significant power to operate. The largest blocks in the Osirion weigh up to 120 tons according to measurements taken by researchers. They were quarried from Aswan, transported roughly 120 miles north to Abydos, then lowered into position 50 feet below ground level and fitted together with such precision that in many places you cannot slide a knife blade between them. The blocks show no tool marks, no evidence of the pounding stones and copper saws that Egyptologists say were the primary tools available during Seti I's reign. Instead, the surfaces are smooth, almost polished, with right angles that remain accurate to within fractions of a degree. A 2008 study by geologist Dr. Robert Schoch examined the weathering patterns on the Osirion's limestone blocks and concluded that they showed evidence of substantial water erosion, the kind that requires prolonged exposure to significant rainfall or flooding. Egypt's climate has been arid for at least 4,000 years. It last experienced the kind of precipitation needed to create such erosion during the African humid period, which ended around 3,400 BCE, roughly 2,000 years before Seti I's reign. When you stand in the Osirion's central hall and run your hand along the deeply weathered limestone, you are feeling something that the mathematics of geology insists should not exist if this structure was built when the textbooks claim. The architecture itself presents another cascade of impossibilities. The Osirion uses a construction technique called cyclopean masonry, where massive blocks are fitted together without mortar, relying entirely on the precision of the cuts and the weight of the stones to create stability. This method appears in only a handful of Egyptian structures, most notably the Valley Temple at Giza, which sits adjacent to the Sphinx and shares the same debate about dating. The Valley Temple and the Osirion are the only two major structures in Egypt to use massive red granite blocks in this particular megalithic style. They both feature monolithic granite pillars weighing dozens of tons each. They both show the same puzzling lack of inscriptions or decorative elements that characterize almost every other temple in Egypt from the dynastic period. They both sit far below the current ground level, buried under sediment that accumulated over centuries. The architectural similarity is so striking that several researchers, including engineer Christopher Dunn, have suggested they may have been built during the same period by the same culture. Yet the Valley Temple sits at Giza, roughly 300 miles north of Abydos, and is not officially attributed to any pharaoh, while the Osirion is supposedly a structure from the 19th dynasty built 30 feet behind Seti I's temple. If Seti I's architects built the Osirion in an archaic style to honor tradition, why would they precisely mimic the unique construction technique of a structure at Giza that no one even knows who built? How would they have known the exact specifications of the Valley Temple's interior, which was buried under sand during the New Kingdom period? The conventional explanation requires not just a revival of ancient techniques, but specific knowledge of structures that were themselves already ancient mysteries. But here is where the evidence starts compounding in ways that strain the conventional timeline past its breaking point. The Osirion's floor sits at approximately 50 feet below the current ground level and roughly 30 feet below the foundation level of Seti, the first temple that sits directly in front of it. When excavators first cleared the structure in the early 1900s under the direction of archaeologists Neville and Frankfurt, they had to remove millennia of accumulated silt, sand, and debris just to reach the floor level. The depth of this accumulation matters enormously. Sediment deposition rates vary, but geologists can estimate accumulation based on local conditions, rainfall patterns, and known flooding events. Dr. Chakra's analysis suggested that the amount of sediment covering the Osirion indicated a much longer burial period than the approximately 3,000 years since Seti I's reign. More tellingly, the Temple of Seti I shows no evidence of the same burial process. Its foundation sits higher, its walls show different weathering, and its construction clearly occurred at ground level, not in a deep pit. If both structures were built simultaneously as part of one project, they should show similar relationships to the ground level and similar patterns of sediment accumulation. They do not. Instead, the archaeological evidence suggests that the Osirion was already ancient and buried when Seti I's architects began building the temple, and that they constructed the temple's rear wall to connect with or incorporate this mysterious megalithic structure they had discovered. The construction sequence presents yet another technical impossibility if we accept the conventional dating. Building a massive structure 50 feet below ground level requires excavating an enormous pit, constructing the building within that pit, and then somehow backfilling around it or allowing natural processes to bury it over time. The Osirion's central hall measures approximately 100 feet long by 60 feet wide, with walls rising roughly 30 feet from the floor. Creating a pit large enough to work in would require removing tens of thousands of cubic yards of earth and rock. Workers would need constant access for materials, tools, and waste removal. They would need ramps or lifting systems to lower the massive blocks into position. They would need to prevent the walls of the excavation from collapsing during the years of construction. And they would need to do all of this immediately behind the temple they were building at the same time, without disrupting its foundation or construction. No evidence exists of such an excavation. No ancient texts describe this massive undertaking. No archaeological evidence shows the construction ramps, workshop areas, or debris fields that should surround a project of this magnitude. The Temple of Seti I, by contrast, has left abundant evidence of its construction process, including partially finished hieroglyphs, tool marks, and construction techniques visible throughout the structure. The Osirion has none of these telltale signs of New Kingdom construction methods. It sits silent and enigmatic in its pit, showing only the massive blocks and the erosion, as if it emerged fully formed from the ground rather than being built into it. Think about the engineering progression that conventional Egyptian chronology demands we accept. Early dynastic Egypt, around 3000 BCE, built mud brick structures and began experimenting with stone. By the time of Djoser, around 2650 BCE, they were building the step pyramid using relatively small limestone blocks, creating the first major stone structure, but still learning the techniques. 100 years later, they were supposedly building the Great Pyramid at Giza, using massive blocks and precision that still baffles engineers, a sudden leap in capability that appears without any intermediate learning curve. Then, over the next 1,000 years, Egyptian construction techniques become progressively more refined but also simpler, using smaller blocks, more mortar, less precision. By the time of Seti I, around 1280 BCE, Egyptian temples used relatively modest limestone blocks, extensive mortar, and decorative elements rather than megalithic construction. The conventional explanation asks us to believe that Seti I's architects, working at a time when Egyptian construction had evolved towards smaller blocks and simpler techniques, suddenly decided to reach back nearly 2,000 years, skip over all the refinements their civilization had developed, and build using methods that their ancestors at Giza had employed. But they went even further, choosing to work with blocks larger than those at Giza, achieving precision equal to or exceeding the Giza structures, and doing all of this 50 feet underground. This is not a revival of ancient techniques. This is a technological regression that makes no sense in the context of how civilizations develop and pass down knowledge. The really mind-blowing part emerges when you examine the structure's relationship to water. The Osirion features a central channel surrounded by platforms, with the entire floor designed to be periodically flooded from underground water sources. When excavators first cleared the structure, they found it partially filled with groundwater, and attempts to pump it dry repeatedly failed as the water returned. The design clearly anticipated and incorporated this water presence, using it as a central element of whatever ritual or practical purpose the structure served. But here is the problem. The groundwater level at Abydos has been rising steadily for thousands of years because of agricultural irrigation, Nile flooding patterns, and sediment accumulation. During Seti I's reign, the water table would have been significantly lower, possibly too low to naturally flood the Osirion's central channel in the way it was clearly designed to accommodate. Hydrological studies of the Nile Valley show that the water table has risen approximately 20 to 30 feet in the Abydos area over the past 3,000 years. If the Osirion was built when the ground level was 50 feet lower than today, and the water table was also 20 to 30 feet lower, the structure would have sat well above the groundwater, making its water features non-functional. But if the Osirion was built during a much earlier period when the ground level and water table were different, when Egypt experienced more rainfall and seasonal flooding, the water features make perfect sense as an intentional design element. The structure was built to work with water, but the water it was designed for no longer exists in Egypt's modern arid climate, suggesting construction during a period when the environment itself was different. Egyptologists point to one piece of evidence for the conventional dating: fragmentary inscriptions found in the fill material above the Osirion mentioning Seti I and his grandson Merempta. These inscriptions do not appear on the structure itself, but were found in the accumulated debris covering it. The conventional interpretation treats these as proof that Seti I built the Osirion. But think about what this evidence actually demonstrates. If you find modern coins in the dirt covering a Roman ruin, those coins prove when the dirt accumulated, not when the ruin was built. The inscriptions in the Osirion's fill material prove that material accumulated during or after Seti I's reign. They prove that Seti I knew about the structure and possibly cleared it or incorporated it into his temple complex. They do not prove he built it. In fact, the absence of inscriptions on the Osirion itself is extraordinary in the context of Egyptian culture. Every pharaoh who built a temple covered it with their names, their deeds, their claims to divine favor. Seti Tomoyarad's temple, directly above the Osirion, is plastered with hieroglyphs proclaiming his accomplishments. Yet the Osirion, supposedly his symbolic tomb, his connection to Osiris himself, bears none of this. It sits mute and unadorned, its massive blocks innocent of the obsessive self-promotion that characterize every Egyptian pharaoh's building projects. The most reasonable explanation is not that Seti I built a structure and forgot to claim credit. It is that he found a structure so ancient that adding his marks to it seemed impossible or inappropriate, and that his builders carefully connected his temple to this enigmatic megalithic monument they had discovered buried in the sand. Several modern engineering teams have attempted to understand how the Osirion could have been built using the tools and methods supposedly available during Seti II's reign. In 1997, engineer Mark Lehner led an experiment to move and place granite blocks using copper tools, wooden sledges, and simple ramps. His team successfully moved blocks weighing up to 2.5 tons using these methods, demonstrating that such techniques could work for the massive but manageable blocks used in most Egyptian temples. But when the same team attempted to scale up to blocks in the 100-ton range, the methods failed completely. The copper tools bent and broke. The wooden sledges splintered. The ramps required angles so gentle that they would need to extend for thousands of feet to reach the necessary height. The team concluded that either the ancient Egyptians possessed techniques we have not rediscovered, or they had access to tools and methods beyond what the archaeological record currently shows. Christopher Dunn's analysis in his book, Lost Technologies of Ancient Egypt, goes further, examining the precision of the cuts and the surface finishes on the Osirion's granite blocks. He finds evidence of machining marks, parallel grooves cut into the stone with a consistency that suggests mechanical sawing rather than hand tools. His measurements show flatness across the large surfaces that varies by less than 1 millimeter across spans of several feet, a precision level that modern stoneworkers achieve with diamond-tipped power tools, but that seems impossible with copper saws and sand abrasive. When you combine the size of the blocks, the precision of the cuts, the absence of tool marks, and the depth of the construction pit, you are looking at an engineering challenge that strains credibility if we are limited to New Kingdom technology. So what are we actually looking at when we stand in the Osirion? The physical evidence suggests several possibilities, none of them comfortable for conventional chronology. One option is that Seti I's engineers possess construction capabilities far beyond what we currently attribute to the 19th dynasty, that they had tools and techniques sophisticated enough to work 100-ton granite blocks with precision, that they developed these abilities without leaving any other evidence, used them to build a single structure in an archaic style, and then abandoned those techniques entirely, allowing the knowledge to vanish. Another option is that the Osirion represents the work of an earlier period of Egyptian civilization, possibly pre-dynastic or early dynastic, when megalithic construction was the norm rather than the exception. Seti I could have discovered this ancient structure during his building projects and incorporated it into his temple complex, effectively taking credit for renovating or rededicating an existing monument. A third and most unsettling option is that the Osirion and structures like it at Giza are remnants of a sophisticated culture that existed before the conventional start date of Egyptian civilization, a culture that possessed advanced stoneworking capabilities, that built during a period when Egypt's climate was wetter and the water table higher, and whose works were later discovered, revered, and sometimes claimed by the dynastic Egyptians recorded in history. Each of these explanations has profound implications for how we understand human history, technological development, and the origins of civilization itself. The Osirion sits there still, 50 feet below ground at Abydos, its massive blocks fitted together with impossible precision, its walls deeply eroded by water that has not fallen from Egyptian skies in 6,000 years, its architecture matching structures hundreds of miles away that we also cannot definitively date. Its purpose, mysterious despite a century of study. You can visit it yourself, walk through its halls, place your hands on the granite blocks and feel the weight of the evidence. The measurements are real. The erosion is there. The blocks are massive and precisely placed. The conventional explanation asks us to believe that New Kingdom architects, working at the height of Egypt's power, intentionally made their lives impossibly difficult to create a symbolic tomb in an archaic style. The alternative explanations ask us to reconsider the timeline of human civilization, to accept that sophisticated cultures might have risen and fallen before the historical record begins, and to acknowledge that our ancestors might have possessed capabilities we are only beginning to understand. Neither option is comfortable, but one of them has to account for what exists in the ground at Abydos. Look at the evidence yourself, measure it against the official explanations, and decide which requires fewer logical leaps, fewer convenient coincidences, fewer impossible achievements by people using copper tools. The Osirion is not going anywhere. It has been sitting in that pit for millennia, waiting for us to figure out what it really is, who really built it, and what it tells us about capabilities we thought our ancestors did not possess. What is your explanation for what should not exist but does?